All right, guys. So thank you so much for coming in and jumping into your group coaching. I appreciate you guys for being here. And for those who are not here, hopefully next time you will be here because again, this is better live than recorded. So I wanted to make sure that everyone again understood the new forms, understood when they're going to need those new forms, because even though we have been training and we've been recording and all this great stuff, I know that a lot of you may still have questions. So that's why I invited everyone today, because I know there's still people out here that have a lot of questions regarding all these new forms, when we're going to need them, how we're going to use them, how can we can negotiate with buyers, how can we negotiate with the listing side if they're not paying commission. So there's a lot of things that we need to learn moving forward with how this whole NAR thing happened. So I want to make sure that you guys are prepared, because if you're not, you're going to be, what happens is that we're afraid of the unknown, right? So if we don't master it or understand it, we're going to be like, maybe not. Maybe I shouldn't talk to the buyer. Maybe I shouldn't talk to this. So you're because you don't have the knowledge, you're going to be afraid to take action, right? And I don't want you to be afraid to take action, because this is really simple. It's not that complicated. It's just the industry is making it complicated. Florida realtors are making it a little complicated, but it's really not that complicated. It's just having the right conversations with the buyer and the right conversations with the seller so that you guys can come up with an agreement to get your compensation. Okay. But I want to make sure that you guys understand that this is really important for you guys to master and know, because I don't want you to be fearful and not take action because you think that you don't know what you're doing. Okay. And second of all, you have me to support you, and I want you to call me when you need support. Don't think, oh my God, I can't do it. If you have a question, just call me. Hey, Teresa, I still don't understand this. I still don't get it. Like, please walk me through it, and then I will help you. Okay. All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And have any of you joined already the mastermind on Friday that they have? And you can unmute at any time, by the way. No?
No, I haven't.
Evelyn, have you joined the master class on Friday yet? That La Rosa's having? No? Okay. And Darlene? Okay. So good thing I'm doing this then. All right. So we are having, just FYI, we are having, La Rosa's having a well, kind of like a master class every single Friday. They're having it in Spanish and they're having it in English. Okay. It's at 11 o'clock in Spanish and at 1 o'clock I'm sorry, 11 o'clock in English and 1 o'clock in Spanish. And it's called the NAR Settlement Mastermind. Okay. So this is a time where you can come in and you can ask questions, you can give scenarios, and we'll be able to help you walk through those. I do join, I try to join both sessions. Sometimes I can only join one, but a lot of times I am there. And basically what it is, it's just some of the brokers are getting together and putting this together so that you guys understand, the forms, you understand the scenarios in case you have a situation that you don't really understand, or maybe how do I handle this? That's the place that you can also go every Friday and learn from other realtors and kind of hear what their situations are and where they're at, and what happened with their client, how they handled it, or how should they have handled it, and which form should they have used if they didn't use it. So it's a really good, if you can make it again, they have it at 11 a.m. in English and 1 o'clock in Spanish. Okay. But they go over these forms as well. But they also just have a lot of scenarios with clients. So that way, at least you can figure out, oh, okay, if that happens, then I know what to do. Okay. All right. And again, make sure you unmute yourself if you have any questions or anything like that. So I'm not going to go into this quick reference guide too much, because this is just a reference guide that was created by our compliance department. And I would not even look at this before. They need to really just take that off because it's irrelevant at this point, right? We're already past August 17th. So what happened before August 17th is really irrelevant. So I'm just going to skip to after August 17th. All right. Yes,
Um,
Darlene. Mhm.
Teresa, actually, I did this yesterday. I wasn't able to stay on the whole time, but I did the mastermind yesterday.
Perfect.
And it was very interesting because they said some things that didn't even dawn on me.
Exactly. And
So,
that's why it's important to kind of join, because a lot of the agents come in and they'll say, oh my God, I have this scenario or this
yeah.
situation with the client or with the buyer, with the seller. How do we handle it? Which form do we use? So it's
Mm,
really good to kind of join because you're going to get a lot of ideas of, situations, right? That are happening right now in the industry with the buyers or the sellers that we might not even think of because we're not working with anyone right now, right? So because we're not working with anyone right now, it's hard, right? So
mm,
I'm just going to go to after August 17th, and this is just for compliance purposes. So this is when you submit your file for review, what the compliance department is looking for. Okay. So keep in mind that all um, listing agreements, all compensation agreements, okay, have to be signed by the broker. So if there's and that they're only doing this temporarily, and it's before you put the listing out, before you send it to your client, right? They have to be signed by the broker because we want to make sure, especially since most of the agents don't know what they're doing, we want to make sure that you guys are safe, right? That the brokerage is safe. So we want to be able to review all those documents to make sure you're using the right compensation form, that you're using the right forms that you need for that transaction, right? To secure your compensation. Not only that, I just saw somebody posted a compensation agreement online that said that they had put on the percentage that they wanted on the compensation agreement $2.25 instead of 2.25%. Okay. So that's how crazy it is that they put $2.25. Imagine if the listing side or the seller side would be, oh, okay, they only want $2. Okay. You know what I mean? And not corrected that person and said, hey, you need to change that to 2.25%, not $2.25. Okay. So that's the reason why we're right now until, this settles down and we know that agents got it, that they understand it. For right now, we're having to review all those compensation agreements, all those listing agreements. Why are we making sure that we review these listing agreements? Because we want to make sure that you're not putting anything in the listing agreement that might get you in trouble or the brokerage in trouble. Okay. So we have to sign those listing agreements before you actually list the property. So if you ever have a listing, you're going to either have to send it to me or to corporate so that I can go ahead and sign off on it. So I can review it, make sure it's good to go, and then we can sign off on it. Okay. We as a brokerage are not accepting C, so on the listing agreement, which I think there's one here, but on the listing agreement, there's a part that says A, right? That says seller agrees to allow the brokerage to share their compensation. Part B says seller will pay compensation. And C says seller is not paying compensation. We are not accepting listings where the seller is not offering compensation. Okay, because we are a cooperative brokerage, right? We're not the type of brokerage that says, nope, I'm only looking out for me. I'm not worried about the buyer's agent. So we are not accepting those listings. Okay. So that's a conversation you're going to have with your seller and say, I'm sorry, Mr. Seller, if you're not willing to offer some sort of compensation, unfortunately, you're going to have to find another realtor because we are a cooperating brokerage and we do want to be able to cooperate with the person who brings you the buyer. Okay. Um, so with that being said, this is kind of just, and I'll share this with you guys too. So this is, it's just telling you um, on the listing agreement, right? The modification to listing agreement, the listing agreement, and all these new forms. These are pretty much the new forms, and they actually have to add now the two other forms that they just released, which we're going to go over as well. But this is just sort of for compliance purposes what we're asking you for when it comes before you submit your file to make sure that the modification of listing when it's required, the compensation disclosure when that's required, the EBA for a tenant agent once that's required, and basically, just giving you some instructions here. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to just go through this. It's just, a bunch of mumbo jumbo. I want to get right to it because if not, this might take a while. So I don't want to take you further. All right. So we're going to go over the exclusive right of sale listing agreement, the one I just said, right? That you have to choose A, B, or C. Okay. and the new things that we have to do. Obviously, you're going to put the same information, right? The seller, the broker. Now, keep in mind, before we were able to put like La Rosa Realty and in parentheses, put, your name on it, no longer allowed. It's only the brokers, okay? So it would be the seller's name and the broker name, La Rosa Realty, whatever office you're in, okay? And then obviously it's the same thing, when you listed it, when it expires, same thing here, address, legal description, what personal property is pretty much in the property that's staying, right? Occupancy, is it or not rented? Basically, that's all the same. Um, and then we have the terms of cash. All this pretty much has stayed the same, okay? So all this stuff really is all pretty much the same. Now, the things that have changed, okay? Okay, so let's assume that the seller does not want to offer compensation, right? Or maybe they're offering, they'll say something like, I'm not willing to offer compensation, but I'll offer a concession, okay? In that instance, you can take the listing because they're offering at least a concession that the buyer can possibly use to pay for their compensation that they agreed to with the buyer's agent. Okay. So if they decide to give a credit or a concession of some sort to the buyer, then you can accept the listing, even though they chose C, that they're not paying the buyer's broker, because they will probably be able to pay the buyer's broker because of this sentence. Okay. Because if they're offering some sort of concessions, right? Seller expenses, because it says seller will pay mortgage discount, other closing costs, right? And some of the closing costs include the buyer's brokerage compensation or concessions not to exceed, and any other expenses. Seller agrees to pay in connection with the transaction. Okay, so basically, if they do put something here, you can. Okay, let's say they put there, I'm willing to give, and now before it used to be a percentage. Now they've changed that to a flat fee. So if the seller says, well, Teresa, I'm not going to pay, I don't want to pay to the compensation to the buyer's broker, but I'm willing to pay, give some concessions to help the buyer um, be able to cover some of their costs when it comes to their closing costs. And again, part of the closing cost does include our compensation. Okay. So now that has changed. It used to be a percentage and now it's a flat fee. Okay. So here, only the broker will initial for now. Okay. You can say, remember it says broker authorized associate. So the broker's initials will be here and authorized associate can be here. So you can still sign here, but we're going to have to sign it before you actually list the property. Okay. Just to make sure that you filled it correctly. Okay. So we before we used to submit the file to compliance after, like, right before we were ready to close, right? And we would submit the file to compliance and compliance would then sign it. Now it's vice versa. Now we have to sign it before you get to, like before anything, we have to sign it first. Before we used to wait until the end to sign it because your signature was enough because we were allowing you the authorization to go ahead and fill out the contracts and do what you do, right? But for right now, the broker is looking to sign everything to make sure that you guys are filling out the right contract. I just had an agent send me one yesterday and he had the wrong contract. He had an exclusive right of listing, but he had it as no broker relationship instead of a transaction broker. And he's one of my top producers. So he didn't even know which form he had used, right? And that's why when I reviewed it, I'm like, I called them and I go, hey, so and so I think you might have the wrong form here because you filled out the no brokerage relationship, and we don't do that in Florida here. We only use the transaction broker. And he's like, oh man, I didn't realize that, right? So I was able to catch that before he actually had his client sign this. Okay. And he was able to change the contract. All right, so same as usual, display property. This is the same usual stuff that we normally fill in. So I'm not going to go over all that. Again, only broker initials. Okay, so the compensation, right? We all know that the compensation, you have to put here the total compensation plus any other fees. Okay. So if you're charging the seller, as a brokerage, you're charging the seller 6% of the total purchase price. And let's say you're also charging them the transaction fee, you would put that transaction fee here. Okay. But you're going to put the total of what the seller is willing to pay the brokerage. Okay. Now, if the seller says, I'm not willing to pay I'm going to pay the brokerage. Let's say he says, well, I'm going to pay you, Teresa, 3%, and then I will directly pay the buyer's agent, right? So you can still put the 3% here because that's what he's paying you, right? Just the brokerage. And then there's a separate part on here that's going to share where he's going to put how much he's going to pay the buyer's broker if he decides to do it that way. Now, to be honest, A and B is exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. Just giving the seller that notion that Teresa, before was Teresa, I'm going to pay you 6% or whatever, 7%, whatever I charged, right? I'm going to pay you this amount. And then we used to tell Mr. Seller, okay, Mr. Seller, from that amount, I'm going to go ahead and cooperate with whoever brings me the buyer, right? That was the traditional way, right? Now it's just giving the seller, no, Teresa, I'm going to pay you 3%. And the other 3%, I'm going to pay it directly to the buyer's broker. So I'm not going to give it to you so that you can go and give it to the buyer's broker. I'm going to give it directly to the buyer's broker. But it's the same thing. It's the same amount. It's the same thing that if he were to give me 5%, right? If he said, Teresa, I'm going to give you 3 and I'm going to give 2 to the buyer. Same thing. It's 5%, right? He could have said, Teresa, I'm going to pay you 5%. And I could have said, okay, perfect. I'll cooperate with 2% with the buyer's broker. Same exact thing. They just had to put it in there to confuse people, to be honest. Okay. I mean, if you ask me. So it's just as a disclosure and to give them the option. Okay. So once that is put in here, now a lot of agents for some reason don't fill out this portion, and I don't understand why, right? Because you have a listing agreement. But let's say the seller all of a sudden decides that, Teresa, I decided not to sell the house. My brother is going to do a lease to own. So I'm just going to, he's going to give me a down payment and I'm just going to lease it to him and he's going to buy it 2 years from now, right? Let's say that scenario happened. If you don't put anything here, guess what? All your hard work that you did the whole time you were listing this property and then the seller all of a sudden decided to change his mind, you're not getting paid, right? Because this is only if you sell the house. But if you don't sell the house, and let's say it goes into a lease option or consideration or an option, or a lease to own or anything of that nature, you're not getting paid anything because you're not putting anything there. Okay. So always put something here. I recommend 10%. Why do I recommend 10%? Because the option could be, I'm going to give, Darlene, I'm selling you my house. I'm selling you I'm doing a lease with option to buy on my house. Darlene, you're going to pay me $40,000 up front, right? That's your down payment. Maybe your credit's bad right now and you have to fix your credit, but you have the money. I'm going to give you you're going to give me $40,000. Now, if I have an agent, right, that was supposed to sell my house, but now I decided to do this with you, Darlene, and you're giving me $40,000, I have to pay my agent something because they did all the work. But if they didn't put anything here, guess what? I'm not paying them anything, right? So I normally do at least 10% because if Darlene gave him $40,000 as a down payment, I get 10% of that $40,000. So I'll at least get paid $4,000. Right? If I have nothing here, I'm not getting paid squat. Okay? So always put something here. My minimum is 10, right? So, and again, that's totally up to you. You can charge 20. Totally up to you. Whatever you decide, right? So now on here as well, I always put something here because there's situations where the seller will say, oh, Teresa, you know what? I changed my mind. I think I'm just going to rent the property, lease the property. Okay, Mr. Seller, that's fine. You can lease the property. But whatever you lease it for, it says of gross lease, so percentage or a flat amount of gross lease value. What's gross lease value, guys? Can somebody tell me what that is? Gross lease value. All right, if nobody knows, the gross lease value is the total rent collected for the time of that lease. So if he
Okay.
rents it for 2 years, okay, he leases it for 2 years, and the total rent collected for those 2 years is $40,000 for those 2 years because he leased it for 2 years. So, he got his total amount that he's going to get in those 2 years is going to be $40,000. Then he needs to pay me a percentage of that $40,000 for me to now go from selling the house to leasing the house. Or if he decides to lease it on his own, because if he decides to lease it on his own and he wants to cancel this contract, guess what? You can lease it on your own, Mr. Seller, but you're still going to pay me something of that gross lease amount because it is on the contract. Okay. So I would also put here 10%. That's my opinion. Again, totally up to you what you want to do, but I would at least put something on there because if you leave it blank and they decide to do any of those two things and decide not to sell the house, you're not getting paid anything. Even if you had it listed for 6 months, okay, and did 10 open houses and paid for photos and did all this other stuff, you're not getting paid anything. All right, so now here. So obviously we always have to put a protection period. Really important, okay? So make sure you put at least 90 days. Now, I'm not going to give a whole class on filling out this contract. I'm just kind of highlighting the stuff that, we should put, but you should put a protection period, okay? And I'm pretty sure I have a class on this listing agreement somewhere else. All right, retained deposits. The retained deposits is if the seller or the buyer, I'm sorry, if the buyer gives an escrow, right, and they're under contract and something happened and the contract, the deal falls through, and now the buyer has to pay the seller a penalty, whatever. They lost their escrow. The buyer lost the escrow, and now it has to go back to the seller, right? It says that the broker, the brokerage, is entitled to a certain percentage of that deposit, of that escrow. So the buyer leaves $10,000 in escrow. Something happens, the buyer backs out, and the seller is due that escrow money, that $10,000. 50%, which is the norm, right? We normally put 50% at least, again, totally up to you, would go from that $10,000. The seller would have to pay you 50% of that deposit, okay, of that escrow. All right, so this is where the fun part comes. So the compensation to buyer's broker. So this is where agents get confused. You have to choose one of these, but we're not choosing this one that says no compensation will be offered to buyer's broker unless they are offering concessions, okay? So they can still choose this and give concessions to the buyer, which the buyer can now in turn use for their buyer's brokerage compensation. But really what we're focusing on these two, right? So it says seller authorizes broker to offer compensation to buyer's broker in the amount of whatever percentage, right? Hold on, let me just get the screen out of the way. Percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee, right? So you can't put both. You can either do one or the other. You cannot put both, okay? This amount will be paid from broker, right, from La Rosa Realty to buyer's broker, Keller Williams, from the compensation amount agreed to in paragraph 8. So what did we agree to in paragraph 8? 6%, right? So out of the 6%, the seller authorizes the broker, you, to compensate a buyer's broker in whatever percent he puts here, or a flat fee. Because the seller could say, Teresa, I'm okay paying you 6%, but the only thing that I want you to give to the buyer's broker is $5,000. I don't want you to pay them 3%. I want you to take as much money as you can, Teresa, because you're just an awesome, awesome listing agent. Just pay $5,000 from your compensation, okay? Or 3,000 or whatever. So then it would either be a percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee, not both, okay? This amount will be paid from broker to buyer's broker. Compensation amount agreed to in paragraph 8. This compensation will be set forth in a separate written agreement between broker and buyer's broker. Okay, so it would be between broker to broker if they choose this, right? Because they're authorizing you to share your compensation with the other brokerage. The other one is, sorry, the other one, caramba, is this one, right? Seller authorizes broker to offer compensation to buyer's broker from the seller. So this is just saying, Teresa, I'm okay. I'm going to give you 4% and I'll pay directly to the buyer's brokerage 2%, $5,000, $2,000, $1,000, whatever that is, right? But the seller, what's going to happen here is instead of us paying it from the transaction, the seller at closing will, so from the proceeds that the seller is getting, now that seller is going to pay the buyer's broker at closing instead of La Rosa Realty paying Keller Williams. It's going to be seller paying Keller Williams. Okay. And then that would be, again, a percentage or percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee. This compensation will be set forth in a separate written agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker. That's where those compensation agreements come in. This is that separate written agreement right there, separate written agreement, and separate written agreement over here too, separate written agreement. Those are all for the compensation agreements that you're going to have to sign. Okay. Now, when do we send a compensation agreement? Who can answer me that? You have a client, you have a buyer, you are going to make an offer. You went to go see the house, your client loved it. You're going to make an offer. When do you ask for that compensation agreement?
Did you ask for it when you meet up with the seller's broker when you show them
Right?
the home?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask for it there if the seller's broker is there, the listing agent is there. But
Or
so
prior to, like,
prior to, you could do it prior to, but remember that you can't not go show the house if your client wants to go see the house.
right, you still show the house, but
You
you want
still
to
show
at
the
least have
house,
an
but before
idea,
you make the offer, let's say
right?
your buyer wants to make the offer. You already know that the seller's listing or the listing side is paying, they're cooperating with compensation, right? You already know. So now you have to get it in writing. So you called the listing agent, hey, Mr. Listing Agent, I'm going to go show your house. Are you offering any compensation? Yes, we're offering compensation. We're giving out 2.5%. Perfect. I'm scheduling an appointment to go see the property this afternoon. If my client decides to make an offer, I'll send you the compensation agreement. Okay. So now you're going to go and you're going to show the house. You already know that they're going to pay compensation. And even if they weren't paying compensation, you still have to show the house if your client asks you to show the house. They just have to be aware that they're not offering compensation, which means if that buyer decides to make an offer on that house, they have to be aware that they're going to be responsible for paying that compensation. Okay. And as long as they're okay with that, no problem. We're going to go show you the house. Now, if your buyer says, well, let's say they weren't sharing compensation, right? You call the listing agent, they said, no, we're not offering compensation, but you can submit a compensation, like a request for a concession with the offer. Okay. So there's going to be new forms with that now. so that we're going to go over. But those are the things that you have to ask. The two main questions before you go take a client to and write these down because they're really important. The two main questions that you're going to ask, and it might be even almost three, are you're going to call the listing agent. Hey, Mr. Listing Agent, my client wants to go see your house. Are you offering compensation? Yes, Teresa, we're offering 2% compensation. Perfect. Is that coming from the listing side or is that coming from the seller? Is it coming from your brokerage or is it coming from the seller directly to the buyer's broker? Okay. Why do we need to ask that question? Because we need to make sure that we have the right compensation form. Because if we don't have the right compensation form, then you're going to run into some trouble. Okay. So that's why you ask those two key questions. So they're the two key questions. Now, there's some agents that are going to say, yeah, seller, because they don't know any better, right? They're in the same boat as you are, still learning. So they might say, oh, yeah, seller's paying compensation. But maybe on their listing agreement, it said this part that the broker, and they're just saying the seller, because at the end of the day, it is coming out of the seller's proceeds, right? So you have to be very specific. You might have to ask another follow-up question. Okay, so which compensation agreement are we using? The broker to broker agreement or the seller to buyer's broker agreement? Which one is signed by your seller? Right? Because when they send the listing agreement to the seller and the seller chose this, then now they had to give the seller the compensation agreement to sign that they're agreeing to this. So they should already have a compensation agreement signed. So you can ask them very clearly, do you have the compensation agreement? Is it broker to broker or is it seller to buyer's broker? Is it La Rosa Realty to Keller Williams or is it seller to Keller Williams? Right? So that you sign the right form. Because if they did this, right, if you just ask if they're paying compensation and they say two, and you send them the broker to broker, the compensation form, but it's really the seller to broker compensation form that you need, you're not getting paid. Okay, so making sure that you use the right compensation form. So that's why you have to do those key questions or those key questions. Now, if they say, no, Teresa, we're not offering compensation, but you can submit an offer and ask for compensation with your contract, you can do that. Okay, and I'm going to show you what form you're going to use to do that. Okay. Because if they're not offering compensation, obviously they don't have a compensation form for you. There is no compensation form because nobody's offering compensation. Okay. But you can negotiate that in your offer. Okay. If the buyer says, oh my God, Teresa, but I really love the house. Can you please try and see if they'll cover some of my costs, through a credit or something like that, and see if they'll cover some of my cost. Or maybe now the seller's willing, if I make them a full price offer, maybe they're willing to pay compensation. Okay. And you can, when you submit your offer, you can do that. You can ask for them to give a concession to help with your buyer's closing costs, which includes your compensation. Okay. But you have to show that house to whatever buyer wants to see that house. It cannot be based unless your buyer instructs you and it's on the EBA. You cannot say, no, you can't call the listing agent and they say, no, we're not offering compensation. And then you tell your client, sorry, we can't go see this property because they're not offering compensation, right? You have to be transparent with your buyer so that way they can make the proper decision, okay? But you have to show them every single house if they ask to see every single house. Okay, the next thing is seller must sign a withdrawal agreement, reimburse broker for all direct expenses, including marketing and property, and pay a cancellation fee of. So we had a conversation with some of the brokers yesterday, as a matter of fact, because one of the brokers asked, a question related to this, okay? And she said that there was nothing written here. There was no cancellation fee written here, but the agent wanted to charge $1,000 for, the photos that they had to do, the open houses where they spend money, the marketing cost, right? But because she didn't have anything here, can she do that? Yes. So if you have a listing, it says clearly right here, seller must sign a withdrawal agreement, reimburse broker for all direct expenses incurred in marketing the property. And, keyword being and, oops, sorry, here, keyword being and, pay a cancellation fee of. If there's zero for cancellation fee, that's fine, but they still have to reimburse you for the direct marketing expenses that you had. And you can charge and invoice them for that marketing cost. Okay. Even if you put zero here. And I guess the broker was confused, or I don't know, the person was confused because since they didn't put anything here, she thought, well, if they didn't put anything there, how can she invoice them $4,000 for expenses? But she could because it says here it's separate. Okay. Again, broker initials only. Okay. Do you guys have any questions so far? I want to make sure everybody's clear. We good?
And it
Any,
come when I'm going through the motions.
huh?
That's when it will come when you go through the emotions, because most through the motions,
Uh-huh.
because most times that's when the questions really pop up when you start
Yeah,
doing it.
exactly. So, I mean, I'm going to share this with you guys anyway, so that way at least you have some sort of reference to go back to. But here's very, very important. Brokerage will not do arbitration. Okay? They're not going to do arbitration. So, which means that these two things will not be signed by the broker. So don't put a initial box in there for someone to sign because nobody is signing those boxes. So when you're doing the contract, if a signature box pops up, you're going to assign it to no one because nobody's going to sign it. Okay. And the reason we decided not to sign as a brokerage is that arbitration takes a lot of money, right? So it's a huge process. It takes forever. Like we have one case in arbitration right now, it's been 2 years. Okay. So it takes a lot of money, right? It takes a lot of effort, and the brokerage does not want to go to arbitration and go through all that. So if there's a dispute, we're going to go and sit down like civilized people and try to negotiate. If we can't negotiate, we're not going to go to arbitration. And at that point, between you and the broker, you're going to decide if you want to take it to litigation, if you want to just go directly to court and skip the arbitration portion. Okay. So we are not signing arbitration. We're not initialing that. So don't put anything for us to initial because we're not initialing. Okay. If the other decides to initial, that's up to them. If they ask you, oh, you missed an initial here, your broker didn't sign here for arbitration, you can tell them we are not agreeing to arbitration. Period. Okay. So that is pretty much. And again, the broker signs, seller signature, seller signature. This is a must regulation, really important right here. After everybody signs and it's an executed contract, we need to make sure, once the seller signs this agreement and the broker signs the agreement and you sign where you need to sign and everybody signed, you need to make sure that you put here when you delivered that executed copy to the seller. Because we're used to sending it to the seller, right? They go in and sign, the broker signs, everybody signs, but we never return it back to the seller completely signed. We just keep it in our system, right? So you need to make sure that you send it back when all the parties are signed. You're going to send it back to them. They don't need to sign. It's a view only when you send it in that loop, but you have to put a date here as to when you send it and by what means you send it. So you're going to have to check one of those boxes. Was it by email? Normally, yes, because we use that loop. Was it by fax? Was it by mail? Was it personal delivery? Okay. But there has to be a date and there has to be a check mark on how that was delivered. Okay. Super important. Any questions regarding the listing agreement? We all good? Awesome. I love you guys taking notes. All right. Agreement seller to buyer's broker. Okay. This is the compensation agreement we were talking about. If the seller is paying the buyer's broker, which means if they selected two, or B, sorry, B, if they selected this one, the compensation agreement that you're going to have them sign, your seller sign, is the seller to buyer's broker. So if you want to put that in there, you're going to put anytime they select B, you're going to also have to have them sign this seller to buyer's broker compensation agreement. Now, why do you want to have it signed by your seller? Because you don't want to have to go back to your seller, because you're going to have to share this compensation agreement with the buyer's broker. Okay. So why are you going to go every time somebody calls you to see if they're offering compensation, because they might be making an offer and they want the compensation agreement? You're going to have to go back to your seller. Oh, can you please sign this compensation agreement? Can you please sign this compensation agreement? Can you please sign this compensation agreement? Right? So if you have one already signed with the listing agreement, you're already going to have it. So now anytime, and the buyers ask you, or the buyer's agent asks you for the signed compensation agreement, you already have it signed. It's not like you now have to go back to the seller. Oh, can you please sign this one because I have to send it to the agent? Can you please sign this one so I can send it to the buyer's broker? Whatever, right? Just have one signed, and then you can just share that same one over and over again. Okay. So you're going to put buyer's broker, right? Which again is La Rosa Realty in our case, right? Whatever office you belong to, La Rosa Realty, not your name. It's buyer's broker. It's not saying sales agent. Okay. Buyer's broker. And the seller. You already have your seller's name, so you're going to put the seller's information in here. You're going to put the property address, and you're also going to put the legal description here. Okay. And now the seller's broker. Who's the seller's broker? All right. Let's say it's Keller Williams as the seller's broker. You would put the seller's broker in here. Okay. Now, on this term, make sure you put, because it says the compensation agreement takes effect when a fully executed copy has been delivered to all parties to this agreement and will remain in effect for, it left blank, 30 days. I don't know why they put that, because what transaction do you know that closes normally in 30 days? Very few, right? There might be some, but very few. So now it's just protecting you for 30 days if you leave that blank. So put 90 days minimum, okay? Will remain in effect. This compensation agreement will remain in effect for at least 90 days. In no event shall the term extend past the termination date of the seller's broker's current listing of the property. Okay? So it should not extend the termination date, including any extensions or effective protection periods, except that upon full execution of the contract for sale and purchase by a buyer of the property procured by the buyer's broker. The term will automatically extend through the date of the actual closing. So what does this really mean? Right? Because it's a lot of a lot of words. But really what it means is that if you go under contract, you're under contract with this listing, right? And you're the buyer's agent. This is just protecting you as the buyer's agent, that if the listing expires, so let's say the listing expires tomorrow and you had an executed contract today, but the listing expired tomorrow, right? Now it's off the market. It's not showing on the MLS anymore. But because you went under contract before it expired, you're still protected for 90 days. And or the term will automatically extend through the date of the actual closing. So you're still protected regardless, as long as you have this compensation agreement signed before the expiration of that listing. Okay, that's pretty much what it means. Okay. Buyer's broker compensation. If buyer's broker is procuring costs of the sale of the property during the term, seller will compensate buyer's broker as stated below. So this is where you're going to put what is the seller paying the buyer's broker. Remember, because this is a seller to buyer's broker. So they had to choose B, right? And on B, they put 2%. So now you're going to put here checkbox right here. and you're going to put 2% in the box. And plus, like maybe the seller said, you know, I'm willing to pay $2,000 or whatever, 1% or 2% of the sales price. But if they bring me an above price offer, or if they bring me a full price offer, I'm willing to give $1,000 bonus, right? Which could happen. So in that case, you would put in here, you would find that out, right? And you would put that here, okay? Other terms, here you can add other fees. Seller agrees, because remember, this is related to the purchase, right? But other terms could be other fees. Like maybe you have a case where you want the seller to pay your transaction fee, whatever it is, right? Whatever other fees you can add them here if you wish to add them there. And again, buyer's broker has to sign this, not the agent, buyer's broker. Okay, which means we need to sign this as your brokerage. The seller will sign it, seller's agreeing to pay XYZ, and now the buyer's broker has to sign. And now it's an executed compensation agreement. Okay, so if they ask you, if you're the buyer's agent and you know that they're offering seller to buyer's broker compensation, this is the form you're going to need from the listing side. Okay, this is the form they're going to need to send you. Now, will listing agents all do this? Probably not. Okay, so they might throw it back on you as a buyer's agent. But as a listing agent, you should have this form already filled out and signed by your seller. Okay, but in the case that the listing agent is not that smart or doesn't know any better or is still kind of being trained, then they might say, oh, I don't have the compensation agreement. Can you just send it to me and I'll have the seller sign it? So they might put it back on you. So you just need to know how to fill it out, whether you're the listing side or you're the buyer side. Okay. All right, now we've already gone almost an hour. So do you want me to keep going for one more form, or do you want to do the other forms on our next training? You guys tell me. I know it's Saturday and, you know, people have things to do. Just unmute yourself and let me know.
You can go. I don't mind.
Okay. So I'm going to go through the finish with this one,
Yes,
okay?
I'm good. You can keep
Okay.
going.
You know, because I also don't want you to have information overload. Even though I am recording this and you can go back and watch it, but I don't want you to have so much information in your head that you're like, oh my God. So dispute resolution, again, this is part of that same form. It's just page 2. Dispute resolution, again, we are not signing or initialing this, okay? So if the seller signs it, that's fine, but us as the buyer's broker are not signing this or initialing this, okay? Miscellaneous clauses. This agreement will be construed under Florida law. Electronic signatures are acceptable. We all know that. Brokers' commissions are not set by law and fully negotiable. In no event will the buyer's broker compensation exceed the amount compensation in the written buyer agreement. Okay, so really important right here. Brokers' commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. In no event will buyer's brokers' compensation exceed the amount of compensation in the written agreement with the buyer. What does that mean? If you have an EBA, right, the new form, the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, with your buyer, and you put 2% as what you're charging your buyer to represent them, and the seller is agreeing to pay 3%. So on this compensation agreement that they send you, it says 3%. But on your EBA, it says 2%. Your EBA is always going to supersede what's this on this compensation agreement, which means you will only be able to collect 2% unless, there's always a but, unless you go back to your buyer and either modify the EBA and say, Mr. Buyer, the seller's actually agreeing to pay 3% for my compensation so that you don't have to pay anything. I'm going to need you to sign this modification saying that it's going to be 3% instead of 2%. And you can do that. Okay. However, I don't agree. And again, it's only my personal opinion. I don't agree that you should put 1 or 2% to represent your buyer. Put 3, put 4. You're going to explain to your buyer that's just in case the seller is paying compensation and they're paying more than what's on this form. This can always be negotiated, okay? But I need to protect my compensation from the selling side, and that's why I'm putting 3 or 4%. Because it's easier for you to put 3 or 4%, and if the seller's offering 2%, you can always say, okay, Mr. Buyer, I'm okay accepting 2%. I'm just going to do a modification to the listing agreement and we're just going to lower it to 2%. Right? It's going to be harder for you to put 1% in your buyer's agreement and now the seller's offering 3%, and now you have to go back to the buyer and tell them, Mr. Buyer, so the seller's paying 3% now, and so I'm gonna have to do a modification to this agreement that says 1% to 3%. What do you think the buyer is gonna tell you? First of all, it's gonna look shady, right? You're gonna look a little shady. What do you mean? Now I have to sign something that says that I'm responsible for paying 3% instead of 1%? I don't know if I want to sign that. Because what if the seller decides not to pay? Then I'm stuck paying you 3% instead of the 1% you put on the contract. Or they come back and say, well, Teresa, well, why can't I take that 2% extra that they're paying and use it for my closing costs? Why are you getting it as compensation? Why can't I get that 2% for my closing costs? Right? So it's going to be a more difficult conversation for you to have if you put less and now you have to go back and put more, right? Because then they're going to look at you like, what? It's going to be easier for you to put more and then say, Mr. Buyer, they're only paying 2%, but I'm okay accepting 2%. I'm going to go ahead and modify your agreement where it's only going to be 2%, so you don't have to pay anything. Now you look like the hero, right? Where the other way around, you're going to look fishy. You're going to be like, the buyer's going to be like, well, this doesn't sound right. Why would I sign something that says 3% when it said 1% before? Now I got to sign it for 3%. And, so you're going to have a rougher conversation. So I suggest you put more. And if you have to reduce it to less, then you reduce it to less. Okay? Because now you're going to look like the hero. But if you put more and less, and you have to up it to more because, the seller's paying more, you're going to look a little fishy. Okay? Or they might want that money to cover their closing costs instead of paying you. So really, really important that you guys understand that. Okay. Again, buyer's broker only, even though it says or authorized associate, we are not authorized at this moment. Eventually, you will be able to sign these forms. Okay. When we feel as the brokerage that you are ready to be able to know, and you've done this 10 times and you already know what you're doing, and we don't have to babysit. Okay. Because right now we do, unfortunately, because if not only is the agent getting fined, if we have a lot of agents being fined, then they're going to start finding the brokerage, and they're not going to have that. Okay. So that's why they're doing that. Okay. Again, buyer's broker, which is kind of crazy because it's asking you right here, buyer's broker to sign, right? The buyer's broker has to initial it, right? It doesn't say buyer's broker or authorized associate. It says buyer's broker. So I don't even understand why they even put authorized associate in here, because the broker still has to sign it, right? So why don't you just put broker, and the broker signs, or broker or authorized associate in all parts? Broker and authorized associate, because when we give you authorization to sign, the broker's still going to have to come and sign here. instead of just saying buyer's broker or authorized associate, just like it does here, right? So it makes no sense. And I'm sure that these forms are going to be modified again. As you know, they're looking at them, as people are complaining, as people are saying this makes no sense, you know, like it's going to eventually probably be revised a little bit more before this is all over, right? So just keep that in mind as we go through the training, but for right now, we have to sign it anyway, so it doesn't really matter, but eventually they might have to change that to broker or authorized associate, okay? Any questions so far about that form, the seller to buyer's broker agreement? No? We're good? All clear? Awesome. All right, modification to compensation agreement. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this one as far as the compensation forms are done, and then in the next training, we'll go through the rest of the forms, okay? So I don't keep you here forever. So the compensation agreement, seller to buyer's broker. So this is, again, this is the modification to compensation, right? So if the seller, and I'm not really going to go into this because I'm not going to go into this one. This is the modification of compensation. So I'm just going to kind of tell you what this form is, and then, you know, we'll have another training on it. This is basically if you needed to modify that, right? So the seller to buyer's broker, if the EBA said 2%, right? And the seller is paying 3%, but now, you know, you're not going to go back to your buyer and remodify their EBA, then you're going to probably have to go and have the seller to buyer's broker modification to compensation to match what your EBA says. Okay, so we're not going to get into that right now. I'm going to skip that one because I wanted to just go this one, compensation agreement, seller's broker to buyer's broker. Okay. And remember that all these forms have either a modification that you can do an addendum to them, you know, so there's every form has some sort of modification to it, okay, for the most part. All right, so listing broker. So this is the seller's broker to buyer's broker. This is when they choose A on that listing agreement. So when you're calling that listing agent as a buyer's broker and you're asking if they're paying compensation, you're going to, again, ask them, is it coming from broker to broker or is it coming from seller to buyer's broker? So that you know which compensation form you're going to be signing, okay? So if it says no, it's coming from broker to broker, this is the form that the listing agent should already have signed and ready to go to share with you. However, again, they might not have it, so they might put it back on you as a buyer's agent. But as a listing agent, you should have this ready, okay? So seller's broker to buyer's broker. Again, seller's broker, buyer's broker, La Rosa Realty, Keller Williams, okay? So whatever the brokers are, not the parties involved. Property address again, same thing, legal description, buyer's name optional, okay? If you're the listing agent, I would keep this blank, okay? If you're the listing agent, because what's gonna happen, and I'm gonna let Kenya in because we have a 10 o'clock. If for some reason, this is the buyer's name, right? I would keep it optional if you're the listing agent, because when you send it to the buyer's broker, they're going to put in their buyer's name. Okay. So I would leave that open-ended, pretty much. Just leave it open as the listing agent. Now, if you're the buyer's agent, obviously you can put your buyer's information in here because you're already submitting an offer with the compensation agreement, and you can now put your buyer's information in there. Okay. But as a listing agent, I would leave that open because now you can share this with other agents as they're wanting to get the compensation agreement. Okay. Again, this has to be signed broker to broker, not agent to agent. Okay. Again, the term, same thing. I would put 90 days, not 30 days. We went all over this. It's the same exact thing that it said on the other form. Okay. Buyer's broker compensation, again, here you're going to put whatever the listing broker is paying to the buyer's broker, whether that's a flat fee, whether that's a percentage of the gross purchase price plus whatever. any other terms, if you want the seller to pay the transaction fee or whatever, you can put all that in there, okay? And keep remembering, brokers only are signing these compensation forms. So that's the only difference. Here again, we're not doing the arbitration, right? So we're not putting anything in there. Again, the brokers are signing, and obviously the seller has to sign because the seller, remember, on A, it says seller authorizes the listing broker. So because he's authorizing, where before it was just, seller, this is a disclosure that seller is okay with the seller, with the buyer, with the listing agent sharing their compensation, or the listing broker. Now it's the seller authorizes. And since the seller is the one that's authorizing this compensation, they need to sign. Okay? So it's and also, I'm sorry, the seller's broker. I apologize. The seller's broker. So the seller's broker needs to sign this. I, Teresa, as La Rosa Realty, my brokerage is cooperating with the buyer's agent. I'm going to have La Rosa sign here, right? Because they're authorizing me to share compensation with the buyer's agent. And then the buyer's broker, whoever that may be, is going to have to sign here. Okay. Now, remember, it says broker or authorized associate on this one. So if you're representing the seller, right? Seller's brokerage, you're the listing agent, and you get this form signed by an authorized associate of the other broker, that could happen. Okay. Do we prefer the broker to sign? Yes. But some brokerages are already allowing their agents to be the authorized associate and be able to sign for them. But that's not something that we want. Okay. We would prefer the broker. So if you can get the broker to sign it instead of the buyer or the authorized associate, that would be better. But keep in mind that some brokerages are authorizing their sales associates to sign at this point, which I think is a huge mistake because there's so many mistakes being done. But hey, you're the broker, you do what you want. But us as a broker, we want to protect our agents and we want to protect the brokerage. Okay. So that's why right now we have to sign all these documents. Okay. Because we want to make sure that you're filling them out right and that you didn't put here that you only want $2.25, right? Instead of 2.25%. Like literally it had $2, like the dollar sign, right here. It had the dollar sign and $2.25. And even though it said percent here, she had the dollar sign in front of it. Okay. So we want to make sure that you guys fill these out right. And that's why we want to review them. Okay. So same thing, all the same signatures, and that's it. And again, there is a modification to that compensation agreement. Okay. So there's always a modification to those agreements. So if something changes, maybe they didn't make a full offer price. Maybe, something happened and, whatever, they needed to do something different. Okay. So that's why they have the modification to compensation agreement as well. Okay. So I'm going to stop here because I don't want to overload you with a lot of information, but I'm going to try to do next Saturday, same time, same bet channel, same link, to do this again and go over the rest of the forms because there are more forms. But I highly encourage you that if you don't want to wait till next week, jump on that Friday session, again, 11 o'clock in English, 1 o'clock in Spanish, so that, they're going to go through this pretty much all over again. It might be a little faster, but, I want to make sure that you guys understand fully how these forms work and when you're going to need them. Okay. So next week we'll go over the new forms that came out, right? Because there's 2 new forms that is, actually I'll share them really quick so that, we won't go over them, but I want to make sure that you guys know which 2 new forms. Obviously if you don't know how to fill out an EBA yet, I have a full training on EBA on the YouTube channel that you can go back and watch. Because you should know how to do this. And again, there's that modification agreement to the EBA in case you ever have to modify that compensation. Okay, this is the showing agreement. We're not going to go through that right now. And the two new forms that they added are the FF and the GG. I think it's GG. FF. Okay, there's the FF. So the FF is credit related to the buyer's broker compensation. So this form, we're not going to go over right now, but this form is going to be used when in that instance that the seller is offering a concession versus compensation. Okay. They're going to offer a concession that the buyer can now use as part of their closing cost. So if that happens, this form is going to need to be signed because it's a rider that goes to the as-is contract. That's basically saying that that concession that's on the as-is contract can now be used to help pay for the buyer's compensation or the buyer's broker compensation, okay? But we're not going to go into this form right now, but I just wanted to let you know that that's one of the forms that's new. And we also have the GG. I think this is the GG. No, it's the CR6, just revised. Okay, so this one is really important. Okay, so we're going to go over this one next week because this one's really important. You can go ahead and research it if you want. It is the GG right here, the GG. I'm like, where's the GG? Seller agreement with respect to buyer broker compensation. Okay, so if you look it up, read it carefully, but we will train on these two new forms next week. Okay. All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining. And
Yes,
yes, go ahead, darling.
quick, if you're right, yes, they did the F and the
You're
G.
you're I'm sorry, my love, you're breaking up and it's coming in and out.
Can you hear me now?
A little better, yeah.
I was saying quickly, yesterday they did go over the FF and the GG,
Hmm.
but they also went over something that stuck with me as well. If sometimes agents say, okay, well, I'm going to sue for the money, they're like, if it's $15 or less, don't even bother because it's going to cost you about $15 in legal fees. 15,000.
15,000.
And the other quick thing is to encourage the seller to contribute, because if you go to that closing table and that buyer does not have the money that they signed, they're going to give to you or whatever at the end, that's where the suit part comes in. If it's not even worth it, you can't do it, but they're not going to stop the closing because the buyer didn't have the money to pay you.
Correct.
So
And
it's
that is key.
better to make sure you can try to get that seller to pay you, or you can do this whole deal and have nothing at the end.
Correct. And that is absolutely correct, Arlene. So that is definitely another training that we can do. But yes, the um even if the buyer signs an EBA, if they don't have the money when it comes to the day of closing and you weren't able to get compensation from the seller or a concession, and they go to closing and the buyer doesn't have all the money to pay you for your compensation, it's not going to stop the closing. The closing is still going to happen. And now you're going to have to go after that buyer to pay you. Okay. And again, like
And
Darlene said, if it's under $15,000, then it's not, you're going to end up losing, regardless, right? You might take it to court and you could definitely get your money because they did have a signed contract with you, but it's going to cost you more money in attorney fees to go through that
and
process.
time and
And time,
time
correct.
and
So
and
because
and
of that, we recommend, yes, that you try to work. That's why we're not trying to accept any listings as a company that's not offering compensation to the buyer side. But you're going
right.
to run into houses or brokerages that are not offering anything. And so if you're depending on the buyer, especially if you know that they don't have the money in the bank, and you're depending on that buyer to pay you at closing, that might not happen if you were not able to secure your compensation from the listing or seller side.
Which they also, in that same arena, they suggest if you have your own lender for that buyer, it's even better because that lender has all the information and they can tell you whether that buyer has the money to pay you or not, because they
That
can
is correct.
sign, but if they have their own and You go to the table like, oh, well, I spent it, or oh, I don't have that much now because I had to pay more for the house. Da, 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 da. So
Yeah, exactly. And that's
that's
why
something.
the net sheets, that's why doing the buyer net sheets are really important because on that buyer net sheet, you're going to include your compensation. So it's going to tell them how much you're going to need at the closing table approximately, right? Because you've had that conversation with the lender. Now the lender's going to tell you, well, Teresa, they need, whatever, $15,000 to close between their closing
Mhm.
costs or whatever. And plus now you're going to add your compensation to that, right? So if your compensation is $5,000, let's just say now the buyer needs to have $20,000 in the bank. And that's a question that you're going to have to ask them. Mr. Buyer, your closing costs, including my compensation, is going to be approximately $20,000. Do you have that in the bank to cover all your closing costs? Because if they say, oh no, my God, no, Teresa, I only have 10,000, then you need to secure your compensation from the listing side because you're definitely not going to get it from the buyer side. Okay.
Right. And then one more thing,
Sure.
they say, um, oh my God, I forgot that fast. It was right here just now when you were talking. That's why I don't be meaning to cut you off. It's just that when I think of something, I have to say it right then. You were talking about um, oh, I know what it is. Let's say how we do the compensation agreements. We talk to the listing agent on all that stuff. They did say that we do not have to tell them what we agreed with the buyer. We don't have to let them know what that compensation or that percentage was. If
Nope.
they ask, well, how much is the buy? We don't have to tell. It's none of their business.
It's none of their business.
So it
It's
does
none of
not
their
have to be
business. So
disclosed.
if you have an agreement with a buyer, your EBA
Mhm.
signed, and the listing brokerage or the listing agent asks you, well, share your exclusive buyer
Expenditures.
agreement, and I'll try to see if I can get the seller to negotiate your compensation or whatever. That is none of their business.
None of their
You
business.
just say, look, I'm looking for 2% compensation or 3% compensation, whatever your compensation is, right? That's what you're looking for,
Mhm.
but you do not have to disclose your exclusive buyer agreement, your EBA. The only people that might ask you for your EBA that is okay to send your EBA is the title company because they're going to need to know exactly what's on your agreement so they know exactly how much you're getting paid at closing. So they might ask you for the EBA, and maybe the lender might ask you for that because he needs to know how much of that money for closing costs is going to go towards your compensation and how much it's going to go towards their actual closing cost. So those are the only two people that might ask you for a copy of the EBA that it is okay for you to share. But the listing brokerage, no, absolutely not. Okay. All right, ladies, I'm going to go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much for joining. This is recorded. I will post it on my YouTube channel so you can go back and watch it. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe because that's where I put all the trainings. But also, let's meet again next Saturday. And let me just make sure before I commit to that because I'm always running around. Next Saturday. Oh no, I can't do next Saturday. I'm actually flying next Saturday. So let's do it. Um, we can do it Friday night if you guys are available. Friday night or Thursday night, whichever you guys prefer.
Probably Thursday night.
Yeah, I was
Thursday,
gonna say Thursday night as well.
Thursday night. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and
Yeah.
I'll send you the reminders for Thursday night, and we'll do it next Thursday, and we'll finish going over these forms. Okay. But I'm gonna go ahead and share this PDF in our chat so that you guys can download. Okay. Actually, you know what? Let me just put it here in the chat, and you guys can download it now because I don't want to forget. I don't want to forget. Um, Evelyn no puede el jueves. No worry, mami. I'm gonna go ahead and record it anyway, so you can watch it later. Let me just attach this document. My computer. And here we go. All right, I'm gonna attach it now. I'm gonna give you a few seconds to go ahead and download it to your computers. Okay, there it goes. Welcome, Kenya and Evelina.
Thank you.
I just
Get back when you're finished.
Yeah, no, I'm staying on the Zoom. So Tiffany, Evelyn, and Darlene are gonna exit the Zoom once they download their PDF, and then we'll continue our meeting. All right, guys. So if you already downloaded, you can go ahead and exit. Let me stop sharing and stop this recording really quick.